So we have created this ball and it's bouncing in place. That looks fine. However, in our sample animation at the beginning of this project, we saw this ball bouncing across our stage from left to right. Well, how are we going to create that? Well, to do that, we are going to or utilize a function called nesting. We're going to place one timeline inside another timeline. And you'll see how powerful that is in just a moment. But before we do that, there's yet another function that we need to do in order to create a realistic ball bounce. Now, if I scrub this ball or play this animation back, I mean, that looks fine. However, there is a problem with how this is being rendered. It doesn't have any blurring. Now, as an object moves, the faster it moves, there's going to be some blurring, and that's a cinematic effect. We would expect to see some sort of what's called motion blur on an object, especially when it's moving as fast as it is when it gets to the bottom of this bounce here. Well, motion blur is something we can just turn on very easily in After Effects. Now, it's not on by default because motion blur actually takes a fair bit of processor strength from your computer, and it can slow things down when you turn motion blur on. By default, After Effects has turned it off just so that it can render more quickly. But if you want to see what this looks like with motion blur on, what you need to do is make sure that the ball layer is selected, the layer that you want to have motion blur applied to. And motion blur is this little icon right here. It looks like three little balls here. And what we're going to do is we're going to just click that. Now, motion blur is in fact a two-step process. Not only do you have to turn it on for a particular layer, but you also have to turn it on for the composition itself. Now, this button right here is the button that turns it on for the entire composition. And the reason why it's a two-step process is because when you're playing an animation back or testing it, it can be very slow if motion blur is turned on. It's nice to be able to turn it on and off at your own discretion in order to be able to get a faster playback. But let's see what this looks like when we turn the motion blur on for both the layer and the composition. And I'm going to hit the RAM preview. Now, it's kind of hard to tell here, but I'm going to just let's see if we can get this right at the bottom here. You can see what's happening. As this ball falls, look at the blur that is occurring there. That is a much more naturalistic cinematic effect. This is something you would expect to see if this were actually a ball being filmed on a camera. You would expect it to have that sort of blur. Now you can see as it slows down, as it gets to the top of its bounce there, that blur diminishes. But as it picks up speed, that blur increases to the point where it's very fast, almost at that point where it hits the ground. And then again, it bounces back up very quickly. There's a lot of motion blur, and then it slows down and there's less blur. Okay. Once we've got motion blur turned on, like I say, we need to nest this composition inside another composition. And what we're going to do is we're going to go to the Composition drop-down menu, select New Composition, and we're going to use all the settings that we had established in that first composition. The only thing we're going to change is here where it says Comp 1, we're going to type in something like Master or main or something to that effect, something that says that this is going to be the container for the other composition. We're going to say OK. And now you can see, actually I had an older composition called master, I'm going to delete that. Now you can see over here in our project panel, now we haven't looked at the project panel yet, but when we created that first composition called ball, it created a new composition here in this project panel. And now we have this new one called master. Not only that, you can see that down here in our timeline panel, we have two tabs, the first original ball composition, but now we have this new master composition. And currently, we have nothing in its timeline or in its layer panel down here. So let's do something. I'm going to just come up to my project panel. I'm going to select the ball composition. And I'm just going to drag it down here, and there we go. We now have a new layer in our master composition, and it is in fact this ball composition. And we have a layer indicator here. Now that's a different color. After Effects has different colors for its layers indicators depending on what type of layer it is. Now this being a composition, this has a light brown color to it. And if I scrub the timeline here, you can see that Well, this looks exactly like what we had in the ball composition. So what is the advantage of having it nested like this? Well, the advantage is that we can access the transform properties that we saw originally with the ball that applied strictly to that ball object, but now these transform properties apply to not only the ball but the entire composition as well. Let's do something. Let's keyframe the position. I'm going to, with the current time indicator at the beginning of my timeline, I'm going to drag this composition over. I'm going to hold down the shift button so that it constrains it to strictly horizontal movements. And I'm going to drag it just so it's just off the edge of my screen. Now I'm going to click on this stopwatch for position, and I'm going to add a keyframe. That's telling After Effects that at this point in time I want this composition or this object to be in that position. Let's drag our current time indicator to the very end of our timeline at 10 seconds. And I'm going to drag that composition over until that ball is just off the right side of my composition. Now you can probably imagine what's going to happen here. I've pressed I on my keyboard to get me to the beginning or the end point of my layer. And I'm going to press the RAM preview button to preview what this looks like. It's just going to take a couple seconds to write this information to RAM. That's what that green line is for. And there you go. There is our bouncing ball. No longer bouncing in one spot, but bouncing across our stage as we've keyframed those position properties. There is the advantage of nesting animations. We can create compound animations. Now, let me see if this is happening. Yeah, we still have the motion blur on for this composition. You'll notice, though, the motion blur is still visible. However, we don't really have it turned on for this composition. What is occurring is that whatever properties are within that original ball composition are maintained in this new composition. And we don't necessarily have to turn that on. It won't make any difference. It'll still be the same. But that is the advantage of having nested compositions. We can have all sorts of changes to the properties of this composition here nested within this master composition. We'll find that as we do more complex animations that this is the way we will be setting up our animations. We will be doing a number of animations within sub-compositions and then placing those within a master composition. And that is how most animations within After Effects are structured.